안녕하십니까. 제가 다시 한국에 올 수 있어서 너무 행복합니다. 제가 40년 전에 한국에 처음에 왔습니다. 그때는 이 연금 문제가 없었습니다. 왜냐하면 노인들이 보통으로 자녀와 함께 살았습니다. 그렇지만 요즘에 이 노인들이 40% 자녀와 함께 살고 있습니다. 그래서 오늘 이 연금 문제가 너무 중요합니다. 저희 한국말 부족하니까 지금부터 영어로 말씀드리겠습니다. 죄송합니다. Today I would like to speak about three areas. First of all, to provide an overview of Korea's economic and demographic challenges. And second, to talk about the current system for providing income for the elderly. And thirdly, to talk about directions for reform. When people ask me about Korea, this is my favorite chart to show because it shows how rapidly Korea became a developed country. In the 1950s, it was one of the poorest countries in the world. In 1970, per capita income was about 10% of the United States. And since then, it's converged to about 63% of the US level. So that's a very successful economic miracle, as we often say. And during that time, Korea was unique because in most countries, growth is accompanied by more inequality of income. But in Korea's case, economic growth actually led to a narrowing of income inequality. If you look at the last few years, though, Korea's convergence process, the narrowing with advanced countries, has leveled off as Korea has slowed down to about 3% growth. And so that is a major concern because economic growth is a key element of coping with aging. And of course, the government has launched many initiatives, such as the creative economy, the 3-year plan for economic innovation, to try to maintain and even increase the rate of growth. Among OECD countries, Korea ranks number 22 out of 34 in per capita income. So we can divide economic growth into labor inputs and labor productivity. So the left-hand column is per capita income. So compared to the top half of OECD countries, the top 70, Korea is about 30% less in terms of per capita income. And that can be divided into labor inputs in the middle column and to labor productivity in the right-hand column. So in terms of labor inputs, Korea is number 1 in labor inputs. Long working hours, high participation by men. And so Korea has a huge input of labor. But in terms of productivity is about half of the top half of OECD countries. And that reflects, in turn, low productivity in the service sector. So Korea does have a great potential to grow faster by increasing productivity in the service sector. Another challenge that has been mentioned is population aging. Today, Korea is the 4th youngest OECD country after Mexico, Turkey, and Chile. That means the population over 65 as a share of the 15 to 64 age group is relatively low. But by 2050, Korea will be the 3rd largest, oldest economy with many people over 65. It'll be after Japan and Spain as the oldest. And that presents many challenges for an economy. First of all, it will put great pressure on public social spending. Public social spending in Korea was about 3% of GDP, this bottom red line, at the time of the 97 crisis. And since then, it's been growing at a double-digit rate in real terms. So now it's up to 10%, which is still about the lowest among OECD countries. You can see the OECD average is about 22%, and the gap ranges from France and Sweden with 29% down to Mexico and Turkey with about 12-13%. Japan is about 19%, the US about 18%. So Korea is moving towards the OECD average in terms of social spending. And the government has estimated that under the current framework, population aging alone would raise public social spending to 29% of GDP, the level that we have today in France and in Sweden. The social spending is relatively low, and so today the tax and transfer system does not have a big impact on income inequality. This is a measure of the Gini coefficient of inequality for the working age population, and so the tax and transfer system only lowers the Gini coefficient by about 3 basis points. And with rising inequality in Korea, as in other places, we've had a trend towards inequality because of globalization and technological change. And in Korea, we've had the same trend, and the middle class has been squeezed. In 1990, 75.4% were the middle class, meaning an income between half and 150% of the national median. Well, the low-income group has risen substantially from 7 to 12.5% in the red, and in the green, the high-income class has also increased. So the middle class has been squeezed in recent years. And as a result of this, the poverty rate in Korea is now the 7th highest in the OECD. The relative poverty rate is defined as an income less than half of the national median. So Korea used to be a relatively equal society. It's increasingly facing problems of inequality and relative poverty. So let me turn to the second issue of how we're trying to help elderly people to avoid poverty. Korea, as we recommend for all countries, has a multi-pillar approach. The zero pillar is social welfare, tax-financed social assistance. The first pillar is the national pension scheme. The second pillar is the company pension system. And the third pillar would be individual saving for retirement. Now, the NPS started in 1988. It started with companies with more than 10 employees, and gradually the coverage has been extended. But one of the challenges facing the NPS is that even 25 or 27 years after it is implemented, many people are still not contributing to the NPS. Many non-regular workers, self-employed, and employees at SMEs escape from contributing to NPS. So as a share of the working age population, in the red line, about 43% of the working age population contributed, and as a share of the labor force, it's about 65%. In most countries, we see rates of 80 to 100%. So this is a challenge for Korea. Because of the low coverage and the recent introduction of NPS, the share of elderly in this right-hand column that I put in red, 29% of the elderly are receiving an NPS pension. And even during the next few decades, it will still remain relatively low. In 2030, the National Pension Research Institute projects that it will be about 40%. In addition to the low coverage, the pension amount is relatively low because people's pension contribution history is relatively short. So the pension benefits are on average around 300,000 won. Another problem that we face is that the pension contribution rate is very low. It's been stuck at 9%, split between employers and employees since 1998. So this is far below the OECD average of a 20% pension contribution rate. In terms of the generosity of benefits, originally the NPS targeted a replacement rate, which means the benefit as a share of average income at 70%. It's been reduced to 60%, then to 50%, and then there was a decision to lower it further to 40% by 2028. So today the replacement rate would be around 46% for someone with 40 years of pension contributions. The OECD average would be about 55%. So Korea, in this case, is somewhat below the OECD average. Given the small pension amounts and the low coverage, Korea spends only about 2%. This blue bar shows old age pension, 2% of GDP on pensions. And so in countries with developed pension systems, the figure goes up to as high as 15% of GDP. So we can say the NPS is still in a somewhat immature phase of development. Given the small pension payments, the elderly in Korea do not rely so much on public transfers. That's the solid blue line, a bar. That's about less than 20%. Instead, they rely heavily on labor income for living expenses. As a result of this, the poverty rate for the elderly is very high. The red bar shows Korea, and the blue bar is the OECD average. So in Korea, up until age 50, poverty rates, having income below the median, half of the median, is relatively low, below the national average. But once we get to the 50 age group, poverty rates go up because workers often leave companies in their early 50s. I think 53 is the average age to leave a company. And the poverty rate shoots up to around half for people over age 65. Now in the OECD average, the blue line, you can see that for the 66 to 75 age group, relative poverty is about 11% lower than for the overall population. So in many countries in the OECD area, they have well-developed pension systems that have lowered poverty for the elderly below the national average. And so for us, poverty among the elderly is a very urgent social issue for Korea. One thing that, a very sad statistic, is that the suicide rate for the elderly in Korea has doubled during the past 12 or 13 years and is now 72 per 100,000 compared to about 3 times the OECD average. So this is very sad. It means that people who work so hard for the economic miracle, many of them are not enjoying some of the results. In terms of financing of the NPS, it's not sustainable under the current parameters of a 9% contribution rate and a 40% replacement rate. By 2044, the red bar surpasses the income of NPS. It goes into deficit, and that would exhaust the National Pension Fund by 2060. So to sum up our view of the NPS, it has a problem of low coverage, as many people do not pay contributions. Consequently, the share of elderly receiving pension benefits is low, and it will not increase as fast as we would hope. The pension benefit generosity, the replacement rate, will be relatively low, and as a result, older poverty rates are very high. And finally, the NPS is not financially sustainable. Now let me turn to the second pillar, the company pension system. In 2005, Korea introduced a company pension system with the aim of replacing the retirement allowance. The retirement allowance, as you well know, is basically a severance payment that companies have to give a worker when he or she leaves, and it's mandated at a 1-year salary for every year of work. But this is not a good system for retirement because workers tend to receive this many times during their career, and they use it for major expenses, such as buying a house or their university for their children. And so the introduction of a company pension system is a big step forward. It was introduced, as I mentioned, in 2005, but even today, only about 29% of employees are receiving company pensions, or enrolled in company pension systems. And that doesn't include the self-employed who would not be a part of the system. One of the reasons is because Korea has a dualistic labor market. As you know, there's non-regular workers who are part-time, temporary, fixed term, or dispatched, and that's about 32% of employment. And these workers, on average, receive about 60% as much salary as the regular workers, and many of them are temporary. So Korea's share of temporary workers is one of the highest in the OECD. People move, these non-regular workers move from firm to firm quite frequently. And given that the company pension system is for people with more than 1 year service in a firm. That excludes many people from the system. Another problem is that small companies have been slow to introduce company pensions. It has to be an agreement between workers and management if they introduce a company pension to replace retirement allowance. So among big companies, the take-up rate is relatively high, but among small companies, only about 11% have introduced company pensions. The small company sector in Korea is relatively less productive. The gap in productivity and wages is huge with large companies, and many of the small companies are in a precarious financial position. In addition to the company pension system, we have these occupational pension systems for civil servants, teachers, and military. And this has been a big issue in the National Assembly, of course, this year, as we've tried to reform the civil servant pension because it is very generous in terms of replacement rate and a very low contribution rate. So it relies increasingly on government subsidies. And so it's very important to try to reform these occupational systems. And finally, just a word about the third pillar. This shows the number of contracts that receive tax incentives for retirement. We can see the number of contracts has grown, the size of assets has grown. There was a small decrease in number of contracts in the last few years. And I think today we can hear many ideas about how we can try to develop this third pillar of individual pension savings. So given that the three pillars are not developed enough to provide income, we need to turn towards the zero pillar of social welfare. So there we have the basic old age pension and the basic livelihood protection security program. So for the basic old age pension, that was introduced in 2008 to provide income to the elderly. Initially, the payment was 100,000 won. And so if you compare this to other OECD countries with their basic pensions, the replacement rate as a share of average income would only be about 3%. So the basic pension is very low. It's been doubled to 200,000 won, but still that would leave it around 5 or 6%. So the basic pension provides a very small payment. On the other hand, it has very broad coverage. So about 70% of the elderly receive the basic pension. So this means that the basic pension gives a little bit of money to lots of people. And as a result, it doesn't have a big impact on relative poverty rates or absolute poverty rates as well. In terms of the basic livelihood program, this program covers about 3% of the population. The criteria depend on income, of course, but also on assets, home ownership, for example, and also on whether the person has family members who could provide income. About 6% of the elderly receive benefits under the basic livelihood support program. And that reflects the fact that many, if not most, have children who could help them out financially, and they do not qualify because of this criteria. So let me finish talking about some of the directions for reform that we think could help this old age income system provide more support and reduce poverty rates. In the short term, while we wait for the NPS and the company pension system to develop, it's very important that the basic old age pension be targeted on the elderly who are most in need, on those who have an income below the minimum cost of living, which means they are in absolute poverty. So instead of giving to 70%, it should be focused on the lowest 25 or 30% to try to bring them out of extreme poverty. And the basic livelihood security program could also be revised by relaxing the eligibility requirements to help elderly get more income. In terms of the NPS, basically when we look at pension systems, we have three options to try to achieve sustainability. The first is to cut pension benefits. In the case of Korea, we would not recommend that because, as I mentioned, the replacement rate is going to fall to 40%. And given that the average contribution period is only 20 years, and the NPRI projects that it will stay around 20 years, that means the replacement rate in practice would be even lower. So we do not think that pension rates should be reduced, and in fact we would support keeping them closer to 50%. The second recommendation that we often give is to raise the pension eligibility age. And for my other country, Japan, that's what we recommend. We recommend raising the age at which people can receive their pension payments. In Korea, people can receive the NPS pension starting at age 61, and life expectancy at birth is around 82. So that means there's a long time after they retire officially to be supported by NPS. So in the long run, Korea should move towards a higher pension eligibility age. It's set to rise to 65 by 2033. But countries in Europe, I think Iceland, for example, has an age of 68, and then they index it to demographic changes, so as the population gets older, the age will rise. In Korea, as I mentioned, it would be a problem because most people leave their company at 53. So that means that they have a long time to go between when they leave their main job till they could get the NPS pension. So at this point, we're not in favor of raising the eligibility age. The government plans to raise a minimum mandatory age that companies can set, which is 55, up to 60 starting next year for large companies. And that's a step in the right direction. So the best option, in our view, would be to raise the contribution rate. If the replacement rate were 50%, we would need a 16.7% contribution rate. If it was 40%, we would need 14.1. So in any case, it has to go up from 9% towards at least 14%. And one thing that's interesting is, this is research done by a colleague, a friend at Kiasa. The longer we wait to raise the pension contribution rate, the higher we'll have to raise it. So if we start now, we won't have to raise it as much. So we think it's very important to begin soon to raise pension contribution rates. Another aspect that's very interesting is that they're trying to diversify the assets held by the National Pension Fund. In 2012, this big red part is domestic bonds. So it was about 64% of their assets were held in domestic bonds. And a much smaller amount, domestic equities would be the green at about 17%. So there's now a target to reduce the share of bonds or fixed income to less than 60%, to raise the share of equities domestic to 20%, and overseas to more than 10%. And so the allocation will be shifted to more overseas assets and to more equities, which should raise the return to the National Pension Fund's assets. So in addition to the NPS, we have to develop the private sector saving for retirement. So we need to accelerate the introduction of this company pension system. So we need to, one goal would be to break down labor market dualism so that more workers would be included in the system. And we have to make the retirement allowance less attractive because workers still tend to favor getting that lump sum payment one time when they retire at age 53, and they can use that to establish a small shop. The stereotype is a chicken shop, as you know, so they use that lump sum to establish a small business. So we need to move away from this old retirement system to the company pension system. And then we have to also make the individual pension accounts more effective. Another aspect that's very important, in my view, is to increase employment opportunities for older workers. So first, we need to move away from mandatory retirement. There are many countries, or some countries in OECD, where there is no maximum retirement age. It's viewed as a human rights issue. Why do you have to leave at a certain age? I know many people, as I come back to Korea, who are beyond 65, who are continuing to be very productive. So moving away from mandatory retirement and abolishing the right to set this certain age would be a step forward. Of course, it would have to happen gradually. And second, this shift from the retirement allowance to company pensions would encourage the employment of older people, because retirement allowance is based on your last year's salary, which is going up very fast. So that's another reason why companies let people go at a relatively early age. And finally, if we could shift from seniority-based pay, where your pay depends on how many years in your age, to a more performance-based pay system, that would enable more older people to continue working. So this would be a very good change for society as Korea becomes an older society. This is very difficult to do, because I know when we try to introduce performance-based pay, the first question is, who's going to evaluate my performance? And if you work as a team, how is my performance going to be evaluated? So we know that company workers, unions, are not very favorable to this type of approach. They would also favor more female employment, because women in Korea, like in other countries, are having increasing levels of education. But in Korea, when a woman leaves the labor force as a regular worker, they often cannot come back as a regular worker. They have to come back as a non-regular worker for a much lower job. And if we could pay people based on performance, it'd be a much better pay for women. The gender wage gap in Korea is 38%, which is the highest in OECD. The gap between what average men salary and the average female salary is huge, and Japan is number 2. So both of my countries have a long way to go in trying to promote more gender equality. So just to sum up, I think Korea is aging very fast, and it's very important that we address the poverty issue in the short run, and in the long run make the NPS and the company pension system and individual savings a key to providing income. So, 대단히 감사합니다. 고맙습니다.